She found the first note on a Monday. It was tucked beneath the windshield wiper of her car, folded into a precise rectangle, the handwriting inside so neat it almost looked printed. She had been running late, the kind of late that makes a person move through the world at a half jog, coffee in one hand and phone in the other, not looking for anything unexpected. She almost missed it. She almost drove away without reading it at all. And if she had, perhaps everything that came after would have happened differently, or perhaps it would not have mattered, because the kind of person who leaves notes beneath windshield wipers does not stop at the first note. The note said, "I see you every day, and I think you are the most beautiful woman in Seoul. I am not ready to introduce myself yet, but I wanted you to know." Adaeze Okonkwo read it twice in the parking structure of the glass tower where she worked as a senior financial analyst, and then she looked around at the concrete columns and the other parked cars and the empty Monday morning air, and she felt the first small movement of something she could not immediately name. Not quite fear, not quite flattered, something between the two that had no comfortable word, something that sat in the chest and waited to be classified. She put the note in her bag. She told herself it was probably nothing. People left notes on cars all the time, she reasoned, though she could not think of a single specific example. She went upstairs and she worked, and by 2 in the afternoon, she had mostly convinced herself that nothing about it was unusual. This is the thing about ordinary beginnings. They do not announce themselves. The first note looked like nothing because the first note was designed to look like nothing, folded neatly, written carefully, calibrated to land at the edge of sweet and be dismissed before it could be examined. This is how it starts, not with something obvious, not with something that immediately produces the correct response of alarm, but with something small enough to rationalize, something just ambiguous enough to give a reasonable person permission to set it aside and go back to their ordinary day. Adaeze Okonkwo had not spent 7 years building a life in Seoul by being the kind of person who did not examine things. She had arrived from Lagos at 24 with a degree in economics, a second language that she had been learning since secondary school, and the specific kind of determination that develops in people who understand early that the world is not arranged for their convenience and has no obligation to become so. She had learned Korean properly, sitting with it until it gave itself to her, and she had worked in 3 firms before landing at the glass tower in Uido, where she now managed a portfolio analysis team and was, by any reasonable professional measure, exactly where she had intended to be. She was also someone who noticed things, spatial things, social things, the small shifts in a room that tell you something has changed before the change announces itself. She had noticed things about the note immediately, even as she told herself it was probably nothing. She had noticed the fold, which was too precise for something impulsive. She had noticed the handwriting, which was too controlled for someone in the grip of spontaneous feeling. She had noticed the phrasing, "I am not ready to introduce myself yet," which was not the language of shyness. It was the language of scheduling, of course, of a man who had already decided how this was going to proceed and was simply moving through his own privately authored timeline. The second note arrived 3 days later, same fold, same handwriting, left this time on her desk at work, which meant whoever it was had access to her building, had walked past the reception desk and the security barriers and the floor access control that required a registered keycard, and had placed a folded rectangle of paper precisely in the center of her desk while she was in a meeting down the hall. This one said, "I heard you laugh today in the corridor. I have been thinking about that sound since. I am working up to introducing myself. Please be patient with me." Adaeze sat down slowly and did not move for a long time. She was 31 years old, Nigerian-born, 7 years in Seoul, a woman who had crossed 12 time zones on her own and built a life in a city that had not made it easy, and she was not a woman who frightened easily. But she understood, sitting at her desk with the second note in her hand, that patience was not what this situation required. It required a name. She read it again. "I heard you laugh today in the corridor." She tried to remember all the moments she had laughed in the corridor in the past 3 days, which was not something she had ever previously needed to audit, and the requirement to audit it now told her something exact about what the note had already taken from her. It had taken the freedom to laugh in a corridor without wondering who was listening. It had made her laugh into something observed, something collected, something being kept. The casualness of that collection, the ease with which he noted it, told her that this was not new behavior for him. "You did not write. I heard you laugh today with that kind of possession, unless you had been listening for a long time." She went to her colleague Ji-woo and told her about the notes, keeping her voice level, using the same tone she used in budget presentations, the tone that said she was a person who had the facts organized and was moving through them efficiently. Ji-woo read both notes and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Do you have any idea who it is?" And Adaeze said, "No." And Ji-woo said, "Have you told building security?" And Adaeze said, "Not yet." And Ji-woo said, "Today, Adaeze, tell them today." She told building security that afternoon. The head of security, a retired police officer named Captain Yu, whose face was the permanent expression of a man who had seen every variety of human foolishness and was no longer surprised by any of it, listened to her account and looked at both notes and said he would review the floor camera footage from that morning. He came back to her at 5 o'clock with an expression that had shifted slightly from neutral into something more careful, and he said, "The cameras on your floor have a gap in the recording from 10:43 to 11:22 this morning." And Adaeze looked at him and said, "What does that mean?" And Captain Yu said, with the precision of someone choosing his words with purpose, "It means whoever left the note on your desk knows where the cameras are and knew when the gap would occur." The small, unnamed thing she had felt in the parking structure 3 days ago rearranged itself into something with a clearer shape. She drove home that evening, checking her mirrors more than usual, which was not something she had ever needed to do before, and the fact that she was doing it now told her something exact about what the notes had already cost her. She mentioned it to her friend Chiamaka over the phone that night, described the notes, the desk, the camera gap, and Chiamaka, who had known Adaeze since secondary school in Lagos and whose judgment Adaeze trusted more than almost anyone's, was quiet for a moment and then said, "Adaeze, I need you to take this seriously from the very beginning, because the ones who say they are working up to introducing themselves are sometimes the ones who have already decided they don't need your permission for anything. If you are watching this and something about it already feels familiar, something in the pit of your stomach that you have been trying to talk yourself out of, leave a comment below. Tell us what you felt. Like this video and subscribe, because some stories need to be told all the way to the end, and this one is not even close to finished." His name was Ryu Song-jin, and she found it out not because he introduced himself, but because he made a mistake, which is the way most things of this kind eventually resolve themselves, not through patience or good fortune, but through the particular vanity of a man who believes he is smarter than he is. The mistake was a flower. It arrived on her desk on a Friday, a single white lily in a slender vase, and attached to it was the third note, and this note was different from the first two in a way she could not immediately articulate but felt immediately, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. The first two notes had the quality of something being offered from a distance, the language of a man presenting himself carefully, managing the impression. This note had a different quality. It said, "I have been wondering if you have been asking around about me. I hope you haven't. I would prefer that we meet on my terms when I decide the moment is right. On my terms, when I decide." She photographed the note and sent it to Chiamaka and to Ji-woo, and then she sat very still at her desk and understood that she had been mistaken about what this was. She had been treating it as the behavior of a shy person with poor social judgment, someone harmless who needed to be redirected. The third note was the correction to that reading. This was not shyness, this was control. The man who wrote these notes was not afraid of her at all. He was managing her, the way you manage a situation you have decided already belongs to you. She went back to Captain Yu and showed him the flower and the third note. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he picked up his phone and called someone, and the conversation was short and specific, and when he hung up, he said, 12 people in this building could have had access to your floor on both days, and we are going to go through all of them, and I would like you to look at their photographs." She looked at photographs for an hour. On the 31st photograph, she stopped. The face in the photograph was not what she had constructed in her mind, not that she had constructed anything specific. She had tried not to. She had understood instinctively that the picture she built in advance would shape what she found when she arrived, and she had not wanted to be wrong in either direction. The man in the photograph was around 35, presentable, the kind of face that registered as pleasant before it registered as anything else. His ID listed him as a senior manager in the investment analysis division on the 14th floor, a floor below hers. Ryu Song-jin. She had never spoken to him. She searched her memory carefully and found one possible image. A man in a grey suit who had been in the elevator the previous Thursday, who had not said anything but had looked at her in a way she had catalogued without examining, the kind of look that you file away without opening. Captain Yu sent the information to HR and to the building's legal team, and the process that followed moved with the careful slowness of institutions that must balance the rights of all parties and document everything precisely, which meant that Ryu Song-jin received an official notice of complaint on the following Tuesday, 4 days after Adaeze had identified his photograph. She knew he had received it because the fourth note appeared on her desk the following Wednesday morning, and this one did not open with the language of longing or patience. This one said, "I know you went to security. I want you to understand that what is between us does not need to involve other people. I am disappointed that you chose this. I hope we can discuss it properly, just the two of us." What is between us? She had never spoken a single word to this man. He had built an entire architecture of relationship inside his own mind, furnished it, given it a history, assigned her a role in it without her knowledge or consent, and now he was disappointed in her for failing to perform that role correctly. She took the fourth note directly to the police. The officer who took her statement was a detective named Park Hyun-soo, a woman in her early 40s, with the specific manner of someone who has heard variations of this particular kind of story many times and has developed the rare capacity to remain fully present in the hearing of it without letting familiarity collapse into indifference. She read all 4 notes in order, slowly, and then she said, "Has he approached you directly at any point?" And Adaeze said, "No." And the detective said, "Do you know if he knows where you live?" And Adaeze paused and said, "I don't know," and felt the weight of not knowing settle into her with a specific and practical heaviness. Detective Park assigned an officer to review the security around Adaeze's apartment building that same evening, and the officer's report, delivered the following morning, contained 3 items of interest. The first, a car registered to Ryu Song-jin, had been parked on the street facing the entrance to Adaeze's building on 6 non-consecutive evenings over the previous 3 weeks. The second, a convenience store camera 2 blocks from her building, had captured him at 11:40 at night on the most recent of those evenings, buying nothing, staying for 6 minutes, leaving in the direction of her street. The third, the parking attendant at her building had seen a man matching his description standing near the entrance on a Sunday afternoon and had assumed he was waiting for a resident. He had been outside her home while she slept. He had been watching her building the way he watched everything, from a distance he believed was safe, which is to say from a distance he believed gave him the advantage of seeing without being seen. She moved out of her apartment that night. She stayed with Ji-woo for a week and then found a new place and gave the address to almost no one. A reorganization of her life that took 2 weeks and cost her more than money, that cost her the specific comfort of a home she had built carefully over 4 years in Seoul, a home that now felt like a place that had been looked at without her permission until it no longer felt like hers. If you are still with this story and you are angry right now, that anger is correct. Hold on to it, because what comes next will ask you to spend it wisely. Like this video if you believe every person deserves to feel safe inside their own life. Subscribe and comment, because this story is not finished, and neither is the conversation it belongs to. Ryu Song-jin was issued a formal restraining order by the court 14 days after Adaeze filed her initial police report. The order required him to maintain a distance of no less than 100 meters from her person, her home, and her place of work, and prohibited any form of direct or indirect communication. He was required to appear in court for a hearing in 6 weeks to assess whether the order should be extended and whether criminal charges related to stalking under Korean law should be pursued. He did not appear to take any of it as a meaningful barrier. This was not a surprise. Detective Park had explained, with the particular honesty of a professional who understands that useful information is sometimes uncomfortable, that restraining orders were pieces of paper, and that pieces of paper required enforcement, and enforcement required violation to be documented, and the documentation of violation required time, and in the time between the order and the documentation, the order itself meant very little to a man who had already demonstrated that he did not treat boundaries as real unless there was a consequence he could feel. The order communicated to him that the system had received Adaeze's complaint. It did not communicate that the system was capable of stopping him, and he had, in her estimation, already understood that distinction. She had changed her routine. She took different routes to work, varied the times she arrived and left, stopped visiting the places that had been part of her regular life. The cafe she liked in Uido, the bookshop in Mapogu where she spent Saturday afternoons, the riverside path she ran on Sunday mornings. She did not do this because she believed it would work. She did it because it was the advice she had been given, and she was not yet in a position to know what was better advice. But every altered route and every substituted habit was its own cost, small and daily and cumulative, paid from the account of the ordinary life she had spent 7 years building. The fifth note arrived at Jiwoo's apartment, slipped under the door on a Tuesday evening, and this was the development that changed the texture of everything, because Jiwoo's address was not something that appeared in any public record associated with Adaeze, not on her work file, not on any registration, not anywhere that a search of her name would produce, which meant one of two things. Either someone had given him the address, or he had found another way to obtain it that went considerably beyond looking at publicly available information. She thought about everyone who knew she was staying with Jiwoo. The list was small. She had told it carefully because she had already understood by then, after the desk and the camera gap and the photograph Captain Yu had shown her, that small was better than comfortable, that the instinct to reach out and tell the people around her was not always compatible with the practical need to limit the number of vectors through which her location could travel to the wrong destination. She had told 6 people. She reviewed those 6 people the way she reviewed a spreadsheet she had found an error in, methodically, without accusation, looking for the place where the numbers did not add up. She did not find it, which meant the list was either correct and the information had traveled in a way she could not trace, or the list was irrelevant because he had found Jiwoo's address through a method that did not require anyone to tell him. This note was the shortest one yet. It said, "I know you think leaving helps. It doesn't change what this is." Jiwoo called Detective Park before Adaeze could. Detective Park was at the apartment within 40 minutes. And she read the note, and she did not say very much at first, which Adaeze had come to understand was the detective's way of processing information she found significant. Then she said, "He is escalating because the institutional response has not produced the reaction he expected, which is compliance. He expected the restraining order to prompt you to engage with him directly, to resolve it, as he said, between the two of you. The fact that you have not done that has made him angry, not deterred him. And anger is a different problem than persistence." She paused and then said, "I want to move this to a different kind of attention." She made a phone call that evening, and the call was to a colleague in a unit that Adaeze did not have the professional vocabulary to categorize precisely, and the following morning, 2 people she had not met before came to speak with her. Not police officers, or not exactly, something adjacent that operated with a kind of quiet authority she recognized without being able to name it. What they told her, between them, was that Ryu Songjin's employment history before his current position contained a gap of 11 months that his resume explained as a period of independent consulting, but that their inquiry had not been able to substantiate. They also told her that there was a record, not a criminal conviction, not an arrest, but a complaint filed by a woman in Busan 3 years earlier, in which she had described receiving notes and gifts and unwanted visits from a man whose photograph matched Ryu Songjin's current face, and had withdrawn the complaint 6 weeks after filing it, in circumstances they were still examining. Adaeze sat with this information for a long time. She thought about the woman in Busan, whose name she was not given, who had filed a complaint and then withdrawn it. And she thought about the 6 weeks between those 2 events and what might have happened inside them to produce a withdrawal, because she understood already, from the particular quality of his notes, that Ryu Songjin was not a man who accepted rejection, and she understood that a woman's decision to withdraw a complaint was not always a decision that had been made freely. She asked the people from the unnamed unit what had happened to the woman in Busan, and the one who spoke most, a man whose name she was given but would not remember, said. She moved away, and the answer had the specific weight of a sentence that was technically complete but had been significantly edited before delivery. This is the part of the story where some people would have left the country, and Adaeze understood that impulse the way she understood most impulses that arise from clarity about what you are dealing with. She had spent 3 weeks being moved out of her apartment, moved into her colleague's home, moved into a new address she had told almost no one, reorganizing her life around the geography of one man's refusal to accept that she had not chosen him and would not. She had spent 3 weeks watching her freedom of movement shrink into a smaller and smaller radius, while his appeared unlimited by any structure the law had so far managed to erect around him. She was tired of being the one who moved. She called Chiamaka, who was no longer in Lagos but in London now, doing a master's degree in international law and possessed of a specific kind of legal clarity that Adaeze had always found useful. The clarity of someone who understands that every situation has a structure and that the structure, once visible, can be worked with. Chiamaka listened to everything, all of it from the first note to the woman in Busan, without interrupting, and when Adaeze finished, Chiamaka was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Tell me exactly what the law says about his employment, about the gap." She asked because Chiamaka had a specific theory, one she laid out with the precision of someone who had spent 2 years learning to think in frameworks rather than feelings, and the theory was this: a man who has done this before and has not faced criminal consequences has learned from the experience what the system will and will not do to him, and he has calibrated his behavior accordingly. He knows exactly how close to the legal line he can stand. He knows the language of the restraining order. He knows how a complaint gets handled. He knows because he has seen it happen before, and he has watched himself walk out of it. What he does not know, Chiamaka said, is what happens when someone decides not to fight him inside the structure he has already studied. "What do you mean?" Adaeze said. His employer, Chiamaka, said, his professional standing. "These are things he has never had to protect from someone like you. You are a senior financial analyst in the same building. You have colleagues. You have a reputation in a professional world that he also occupies. And there is a woman in Busan who filed a complaint and withdrew it. And the question I would be asking is whether she withdrew it because she was frightened or because she was given something. And if she was given something, that is a different kind of story entirely." Adaeze sat with that after she hung up, turning it over the way she turned over a financial model that had produced an unexpected result, looking not for the error, but for the logic she had not yet located. A man who had done this before. A man who had watched a complaint get filed and then get withdrawn and had walked away from it with a gap in his employment record and a new city, and the understanding that the process could be endured because the process had a limited appetite for persistence while he did not. He had outlasted it. He had waited, and the system had moved on, and so had he. She thought about the patience required for that. The patience of someone who did not experience the passage of time the way most people did, not as something that diminished what he wanted, but as something to be navigated, an obstacle with known dimensions that could be moved through if you simply refused to be in a hurry. She had spent 7 weeks being exhausted by his patience, and now Chiamaka was suggesting that his patience was also his vulnerability, because a man who had learned to outlast one kind of institutional response had not prepared for a different kind. He had prepared for a complaint to be filed and for that complaint to run its institutional course. He had not prepared for someone to start asking why the complaint in Busan had been withdrawn, or to find the answer, or to find the woman, or to find what the woman had kept. She thought about a woman in Daegu, a city she had never been to, keeping a folder in a drawer for 3 years. She thought about what it meant to keep something like that, to preserve it through the move and the new city and the new job and the long project of rebuilding a life, to carry it through all of that and not throw it away, even when throwing it away would have been the easier thing, even when keeping it was its own reminder of a chapter she was trying to close. She had kept it because she understood something that the institutional process had not articulated clearly enough, that documentation is the only form of evidence that cannot be revised by someone else's account of events, and that there would eventually be a day when someone would need it. Adaeze thought about that for a long time after she hung up. She thought about a man who had spent years moving from one city to another, relying on the fact that institutional processes were slow and complaints were expensive, and women who were frightened eventually went quiet. She thought about how well that strategy had worked, and she thought about what it would mean to be the person it did not work on. She called Detective Park the next morning. The investigation into the Busan complaint, reinvestigated now with a different level of institutional weight behind it, took 3 weeks. The woman in Busan, whose name was Choi Mina, was contacted by Detective Park's colleague in the Busan district, and she did not immediately agree to speak. She needed 4 days and 2 more phone calls and a specific assurance, one that Detective Park had consulted with a prosecutor to be able to give before she agreed to a recorded interview. What Choi Mina described in that interview was a pattern that Adaeze recognized with the specific recognition of someone seeing their own experience reflected in a stranger's account. The notes, the appearance outside her home, the escalation when she did not respond as expected, the restraining order that he had violated, and then a different kind of pressure applied through her employer, where he had connections, suggestions made to her professionally, that her situation had become complicated, that perhaps it would be simpler for everyone if she resolved it quietly. She had withdrawn the complaint, and she had also left her job, and she had left Busan, and she had done all of this because she had understood, at that point, that the institution was not going to protect her, and that he knew it. But she had kept the notes. All of them, in a folder in her apartment in Daegu, where she had moved, were preserved with the particular care of a person who no longer trusts institutions but understands that documentation is the only kind of currency that retains its value when everything else collapses. She sent the folder to Detective Park by registered post the following day. The notes from Busan were not identical to the notes left for Adaeze. They were never going to be identical. A man like Ryu Song-jin was too careful for that. But they had the same architecture, the same movement from offering to entitlement, the same turn when the expected compliance did not arrive, the same language of what is between us, and I had hoped you understood. Side by side, they told a story that a single set of notes could not tell alone. They told the story of a pattern. The prosecutor who reviewed the combined evidence filed charges 10 days later. Not a restraining order, not a civil complaint. Criminal charges under South Korea's Stalking Punishment Act, with Choi Mina's documented experience cited as evidence of a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. The charges carried the possibility of a prison sentence, and the possibility of a prison sentence changed the geometry of everything, because it was no longer a matter of how close to the legal line Ryu Song-jin had calculated he could stand. He was no longer standing near the line. He was on the other side of it. He was arrested on a Thursday morning at his office, which was 1 floor below the office where Adaeze was sitting when it happened, and she knew about it because Detective Park had called her 30 minutes before it happened and told her it was coming and asked if she wanted to be somewhere else. She said no. She sat at her desk and she worked, and she heard nothing from the floor below, and at 11:15 Detective Park called again and said, "It's done." She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, and then she called Chiamaka, and Chiamaka answered on the second ring, and Adaeze said, "They arrested him," and Chiamaka said, "I know. Park called me first. Is that strange?" And Adaeze said, "Not even slightly," and then she could not speak for a moment. Not because she was crying, exactly, but because something that had been held at a specific tension inside her for 7 weeks had just released, and the release had a physical quality, like a knot worked loose from the inside. Chiamaka said nothing, because Chiamaka was the kind of person who understood when silence was not emptiness, but its own form of presence. When Adaeze could speak again, she said, "The woman in Busan, Choi Mina. I want to call her." "Is that appropriate? Is that something that is done?" Chiamaka said, "I don't know if it is something that is done, but I know it is something you should do, and those are not always in the same category." She called Choi Mina that evening. The conversation lasted 40 minutes, and most of it was not about Ryu Song-jin at all, or not directly. It was about Busan and Daegu and Lagos and Seoul, about what it costs a person to rebuild the ordinary infrastructure of a life that has been disrupted by someone else's refusal to respect its boundaries, about the specific exhaustion of having to be strategic about your own safety in a world that should simply provide it. They did not have a great deal in common in the surface details of their lives, but they recognized each other in the way people recognize each other when they have been through a version of the same thing, which is to say immediately and without needing to explain it. At the end of the call, Choi Mina said, "I was afraid that sending the notes would not make a difference, that it would go the same way it went before." And Adaeze said, "I was afraid too." And then she said, "I think that might be the thing he counted on." And the silence that followed had the quality of 2 people arriving at the same understanding from slightly different directions. The trial took 4 months. Both Adaeze and Choi Mina testified. Adaeze gave her testimony in Korean, which was not her first language, which was not her second language, which was the language she had learned in the 7 years she had spent making Seoul account for her on her own terms, and she gave it with the precision and composure of someone who has organized the facts carefully and trusts them to do what facts are meant to do when arranged correctly. She did not look at Ryu Song-jin while she spoke, not because she was afraid to, but because he was not the audience. The court was the audience. The record was the audience. The precedent that would outlive this particular room was the audience. Choi Mina testified on the second day, having traveled from Busan and sat alone in a hotel room the night before, going through her notes the way you go through something you have carried for a long time and are finally preparing to set down somewhere permanent. Her Korean was quieter than Adaeze's, slower, shaped by the particular hesitation of someone who had spent 3 years not saying this out loud to anyone who had the power to do something with it. But it was complete. She had kept the folder because she had the instinct, even when she was afraid, that completeness mattered, and the instinct had been correct. Adaeze watched Choi Mina testify from the gallery and felt something she did not have an exact word for, something in the register of gratitude but more active than that. Something that understood that Choi Mina's 3 years of keeping the folder had made it possible for both of them to be in this room doing what they were doing. The women who came before you and kept their evidence, even when keeping it cost them, something are not abstract or historical. They are sitting in courtrooms with you, their documentation in a folder on the prosecutor's table, their experience giving your experience the structure a single account cannot provide alone. He was convicted. The sentence was 2 years, which is a number that means different things depending on where you are standing when you hear it. For a prosecutor, it represents a proportionate consequence applied correctly. For Choi Mina, sitting in the gallery and hearing it, it represented the answer to a question she had asked herself in Busan 3 years ago about whether the system was capable of arriving at a different conclusion if the evidence was complete enough. For Adaeze, it represented the end of the particular vigilance that had structured her life for nearly a year, the slow unwinding of a readiness she had been maintaining so long it had begun to feel like a permanent condition rather than a response to a temporary one. For Ryu Song-jin's attorney, it represented grounds for appeal, which was filed and which took another 7 months to resolve. The appeal was denied. Adaeze heard about the denial on a Wednesday morning while sitting in a cafe in Mapo-gu, a place she had started visiting on Wednesday mornings because it had good light and good coffee and a corner table where she could work without being interrupted, and she had started going to it because she was slowly rebuilding the ordinary infrastructure of a life, returning to the things that make days feel like they belong to the person living them rather than to whatever has disrupted them. She put her phone down, looked out at the street, and did not move for a moment. The street was doing what the street always did at this hour. People arriving at offices, a delivery driver stacking boxes at the entrance of the building opposite, a woman with a stroller navigating around a group of uniformed students who had stopped to argue over something on one of their phones. Nothing was different out there, and everything inside her had just rearranged itself slightly, the last degree of tension releasing from something that had been held at a specific angle for over a year. She thought about the 7 notes. She still had them, photographed, the originals submitted as evidence, photographed copies kept in the same drawer where she kept her passport and her lease and her employment contract, the documents that establish, in formal terms, who a person is and what they have the right to occupy. She had kept them not because she needed them anymore, but because she understood that the act of preserving them had been an act of refusing to let the experience be managed into a version that was easier for everyone else to handle, and she was not yet ready to stop refusing. She had thought about destroying them several times, had wanted the act of destroying them to do what it would feel like it was doing, which was removing the thing from existence. But removing a photograph of a note from a drawer does not remove the note from the drawer it was designed to access. She kept them instead and let them be evidence of what had happened rather than a wound that needed to be concealed. She thought about Chiamaka, who had graduated and was now working at a firm in Brussels that handled cases at the intersection of international human rights law and digital privacy, and who sent Adaeze voice messages at odd hours from different time zones with the same energy she had always had, which was the energy of a person who believes that the world's structural problems are exactly that, structural, which means they can be examined and understood and, given the right tools and the right people holding them, changed. Chiamaka had called her after the original verdict and said, "You know what you did?" And Adaeze had said, "We?" And Chiamaka had said, "Yes, we." And the pronoun had felt like something being handed back, the understanding that none of it had been hers to carry alone, even when it had felt that way. She thought about Ji-woo, who had started a support group that met on the first and third Thursdays of every month in a community center in Seoul for people navigating exactly this kind of situation, and had named it, with the particular quiet wit that Adaeze had always loved about her, after a word in Korean that meant to disentangle, to separate a knot into its component threads so that it can be worked with rather than simply pulled tighter. The group had 12 members the first month and 31 by the 6th, which told Adaeze something she had understood in theory but now understood from the inside, that the experience of being watched without consent, followed without acknowledgement, claimed by someone who had never asked permission, was not unusual. It was common enough that a group that met twice a month in a borrowed community room had filled itself in less than a year. She thought about Choi Mina, who had moved back to Busan. Not the same apartment, not the same area, but Busan, the city that had been taken from her and that she had decided, after the verdict, to take back. She had sent Adaeze a photograph of the view from her new apartment, the harbour in the early morning, the light flat and silver on the water, and the message attached said only, "I can see the sea from here." Adaeze had looked at that photograph for a long time. There was no adequate language for what Choi Mina's 3 years of holding onto a folder had made possible. No word that captured the specificity of what she had done, which was to preserve an uncomfortable truth in a drawer across a move and a new city and all the ordinary and expensive work of rebuilding a life, to preserve it not knowing whether it would ever be needed, because she understood that some things should be kept against the possibility that they will matter. She thought about a note that said, "I am working up to introducing myself. Please be patient with me." And she thought about what the man who wrote that note had understood about patience and what he had misunderstood about it. He had understood patience as waiting, as the management of time until the moment he had decided was right. He had understood himself as the one doing the deciding, the one authoring the sequence, the one determining when the conditions were correct for the next step of a plan that no one had agreed to but him. He had not understood that patience is not the same as control. He had not understood it as the thing she and Choi, Mina and Ji-woo and Detective Park and the prosecutor and Chiamaka had practiced, which was a different kind entirely. The patience of people who understand that the correct outcome sometimes requires a longer route than you intended when you started walking, and who walk it anyway, carefully, without announcing it, all the way to the end. She finished her coffee. She opened her laptop. She had a report due at noon, and the morning light in the cafe was exactly as good as she had learned to expect it to be, and she had a corner table and nowhere she needed to be until noon, and Seoul was doing what Seoul always did outside the window, going on, luminous and indifferent and magnificent, the city that had not made it easy and had made her, because of that, into something more precise and more deliberate than she might otherwise have become. She worked, and the working felt like the correct and unremarkable thing to be doing on a Wednesday morning in a cafe in Mapogu, which is to say it felt like a life that belonged to her, which was the only thing she had ever asked for, the thing that should have been too ordinary to require fighting for, and the thing that had required fighting for anyway, and the thing she had fought for and won. There is a particular kind of person who looks at a clear boundary and reads it as a suggestion, who receives the word no and hears it as a temporary condition rather than a final answer, who builds an entire edifice of imagined relationship on the foundation of another person's existence, without asking, without acknowledgement, without a single moment of genuine exchange, and then holds that person responsible for failing to inhabit the role they were assigned. That person is not romantic. He is not complicated. He is not a man shaped by some wound you do not fully understand, who simply needs to be helped to a different understanding of things. He is a man who has decided that what he wants matters more than what you have said, and there is no version of patience or understanding or private resolution that changes that calculus. It only changes when the consequences of that decision become real, structural, and impossible to absorb and move on from. Adaeze did not save herself by being extraordinary. She saved herself by being extremely ordinary in exactly the right ways. She documented everything, she told people, She went to the institutions that existed to be gone to, and then she found the people inside those institutions who understood that their job was not to manage her inconvenience, but to take what she was describing seriously. She refused to be moved indefinitely, and she refused to be quiet. And she found the woman in Busan, and she let that woman's kept notes do what kept notes are for, which is to tell the story that could not be told from a single vantage point alone. And Choi Mina, who had been afraid that sending the folder would change nothing, who had kept those notes in a drawer for 3 years in a city she had chosen because it was far from the one he had pushed her out of, who had been given a reason, at last, to take them out of the drawer and hand them to someone who would use them correctly. She did not save Adaeze, but she made it possible to save them both, and that is something the word save does not quite fit, is something better described by a different word, a word from the language of people who understand that harm travels forward through time, and that the only reliable way to stop it is to change the conditions that allow it to continue. What would you have done if a man decided, without ever speaking to you, that you were his, and acted on that decision with the patience of someone who has never yet faced a real consequence for anything? What would you have done? Would you have left, as the system quietly suggested, might be the easiest solution? Would you have waited for him to stop simply? Or would you have understood, the way Adaeze understood after the 4th note, that waiting for him to stop was exactly what he was counting on? Tell us in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs to understand that no is a complete sentence, that it does not require a reason or an apology or a negotiation, and that a person who cannot hear it is not romantic, not complex, not a story waiting for a different ending. He is simply a person who has decided that his version of the world takes precedence over yours, and he is wrong, and he needs to know that there are people who will make sure he knows it. That is what Adaeze did. That is what Choi Mina did. That is what the support group in Seoul does every 1st and 3rd Thursday. And that is what this story is for.